Ask someone in the street today, what was America's greatest battle? And you'll probably hear a number of answers. Gettysburg, Normandy, perhaps even Midway. To be fair, all battles with a strong claim to the title. But what you probably won't hear is the Meuse-Argonne. But why not? That's a bit of a mystery. Not only was it the largest battle in US history, involving more than 1 million American soldiers, but day by day was far deadlier than the Normandy campaign, and it also played a major role in bringing the First World War to an end. And perhaps most importantly, it was where many of the men who would lead the United States in the Second World War first learned to fight. George Marshall, George Patton, Douglas MacArthur, and even Harry Truman were there. Yet compared to Gettysburg or D-Day, the Meuse-Argonne receives remarkably little attention. So why is this battle so important, and does it deserve to be remembered as America's greatest battle? In this video, we'll explore that very question. By September 1918, the First World War had entered its 5th year and already cost millions of lives. Entire landscapes had been transformed into shattered wastelands of trenches, shell craters and barbed wire. Empires had fallen and economies had been exhausted, and still the fighting continued. Yet despite appearances, the balance of the war had shifted dramatically. Earlier that year, Germany had launched a series of massive offensives on the Western Front in a final attempt to win the war before American manpower could decisively turn the tables. Initially, those attacks had achieved impressive gains, but they had ultimately failed, and now it was the Allies' turn. From late July and then again in early August, British, French and Belgian armies had begun attacking up and down the line and were steadily advancing in what became known as the 100 Days Offensive. Yet Germany was not yet defeated. Far from it. Its armies remained dangerous and capable of fierce resistance. But for the first time in years, Allied commanders could realistically begin thinking not about surviving the war, but about ending it. The question was how. For General John "Black Jack" Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, the answer lay here in the Meuse-Argonne. Most often, incorrectly, called the Meuse in the United States, the Meuse and the Argonne were actually the two bookends to the battlefield on which the doughboys would fight. To the east was the Meuse River, picturesque waterway winding its way through the shattered city of Verdun and northwards through German lines. It had already seen horrific fighting in 1916, and the whole area was a mass of shell craters and destruction. To the west, on the far end of the battlefield, about 24 miles away, was this, the Argonne Forest. Thickly wooded and perched on high ground, it too had seen heavy fighting and was an attacker's nightmare. Interwoven in the undergrowth, fallen tree stumps and hidden valleys and ravines were an elaborate network of machine gun posts, trenches and gun pits, all protected by masses of rusting barbed wire. Between them lay a corridor of broken ground, ridges, villages and defensive positions stretching north more than 30 miles towards the German-held vital railway hub of Sedan. But why attack here at all? The answer lies with that railway. By 1918, the German army depended heavily upon an extensive rail network to move troops and supplies along the Western Front. One of the most important routes ran through Sedan before continuing toward the fighting further west. If that network could be threatened, German forces would face an enormous logistical problem, and a large-scale withdrawal was likely. The challenge was that the Germans knew this too. For years they had transformed the sector into a formidable defensive zone, with well-seasoned troops and defences running for miles into the rear. It would be an extremely tough nut to crack. So who exactly was going to do it? Just a few months earlier, many Allied commanders still viewed the American army with a degree of skepticism. Keen, personally courageous and physically fit, they had the makings of a war-winning army but lacked experience, tended to be over-aggressive and often relied on outdated infantry-heavy tactics. That's not surprising, to be fair. The doughboys were relatively new, having only arrived in large numbers from mid-1918, and many had yet to see serious action. In comparison, the British, French and Germans were all much more used to the evolving way of fighting in trench warfare. Nevertheless, Pershing was convinced his men could get the job done, and that they should and would play a major role in the coming offensives, and by September 1918 he had evidence to support his case. Only days earlier, American forces had launched their first major independent offensive at Saint-Mihiel. The operation had been a striking success, and a long-occupied salient had been reduced in just a few days, for relatively little loss. Now Pershing wanted something much bigger in the Meuse-Argonne. The problem was that the troops needed for the Meuse-Argonne were not standing ready on the start line. Many were still around Saint-Mihiel, and some literally still fighting, 60 miles away. Others were scattered across the other sectors of the front. So how do you gather an army of that size? The answer fell largely to one man, Colonel George Marshall, then a relatively unknown staff officer facing an immense challenge. Not only did he have to move 600,000 American troops, 15,000 vehicles, thousands of artillery pieces, 90,000 horses and mules, and countless tons of other supplies across an already shattered battlefield, but he had to do it on an already overstretched transport system at night and without the enemy finding out. Despite the inevitable episodes of complete chaos, within 14 days the bulk of the AEF had been repositioned for the coming offensive. Marshall later called it my greatest contribution to the war. But getting there was just the beginning. The real question was whether the army was ready for what came next. The terrain was well suited to the defenders. With those two prominent heights next to the Meuse and the Argonne, German artillery batteries could fire enfilade into attacking troops and force them into frontal assaults on prominent fortified villages and strongpoints in the more open middle ground. Perhaps the most important of those, located right in the heart of the battlefield, was Montfaucon. Rising some 500 feet above the surrounding countryside, the hill dominated much of the central sector. Today it's difficult to appreciate just how commanding a position it was, but in 1918 it offered German observers a near uninterrupted view across large sectors of the battlefield, from which they could watch roads, villages, assembly areas and advancing troops, and direct artillery and machine gun fire with deadly accuracy. For the Americans, Montfaucon represented a serious problem. For the Germans, it was the cornerstone of their defence. As the evening of the 25th September drew to a close, hundreds of thousands of American soldiers began moving quietly into their assembly positions. All across the front, officers and men prepared for battle. Among them was Major Charles Whittlesey, a New York lawyer who had volunteered for the army on the outbreak of war. Ahead of him and his men of the 308th Infantry was the dark mass of the Argonne. Theirs would not be a battle of sweeping manoeuvre, but a slow, brutal fight through truly hellish terrain. At precisely 2:30 a.m. on the 26th September 1918, the silence was broken as more than 2,700 guns opened up along a 24-mile front. Shell after shell screamed overhead towards the German positions, and the continuous concussion rolled across the battlefields like thunder, rattling dugouts, splintering trees, and shaking the ground beneath the waiting infantry. The fire was so heavy that Artillery Captain Harry Truman, commanding a battery of 4 75mm guns, remembered how he had to continually douse his guns with water to stop the barrels melting. His battery would fire more than 3,000 rounds in a 24-hour period. On the receiving end, the effect was devastating, as one German regimental history recalled. The detonations followed each other without interruption, and the air was torn by a constant droning sound. In the villages, the remaining ruins soon tumbled down. In the forested areas, the chaos of trees and roots became ever more confused. Yet the bombardment did more than simply destroy. It transformed the battlefield itself. Thousands of explosions threw up enormous clouds of dust, smoke and pulverized earth. Artificial smoke rounds and the yellow-brown haze of mustard gas added to the confusion. For the defenders, it was terrifying. For the attackers, it would soon become a problem of its own. Then, shortly before dawn, the artillery barrage began to creep forward. This was the signal. Along a front stretching from the Meuse to the Argonne, hundreds of thousands of American soldiers climbed from their positions and started forward. Right in the centre with the 79th Division was Private Arthur Joel, who described that moment. A Company over. E Company ahead. 3rd Platoon advance. Combat groups about 30 paces. Scouts out. And the regiment began its part in one of America's greatest battles. The area of bursting shells of the creeping barrage advanced ahead of the troops at about their own rate of speed. These were fired overhead by guns of all calibers directly behind. The waves and groups advanced at about an ordinary pace. At first the platoons were under good control, but in a very short time squads and files were separated in the fog and smoke. Meeting mostly stunned or overwhelmed defenders, the central attack started well, and before long the doughboys were advancing on the looming mass of Montfaucon. On the east side of the battlefield, alongside the Meuse, troops of 3rd Corps also pushed forward against the German front line and the heights either side of the river, which were their immediate objective, and met with significant success. Further west though, in the Argonne Forest, 1st Corps entered a very different battlefield altogether, as Captain Walter Rainsford remembered. I climbed out with the nearest platoon into darkness and impenetrable fog mixed with powder smoke, started them forward and went to look for, or feel for, the others. One could literally not see 2 yards, and everywhere the ground rose into bare pinnacles and ridges, or descended into bottomless chasms half filled with rusted tangles of wire. Back in the centre by late morning, elements of the 79th Division making their combat debut approached the lower slopes of Montfaucon. To their left and right, more experienced divisions including the 4th and 37th advanced rapidly, in some places overrunning forward German positions before the defenders had fully recovered from the bombardment, and for a brief moment it seemed the defenders of Montfaucon might not put up much of a fight. Those hopes were quickly dispelled as the leading troops came into range of the veteran 11th Grenadier Regiment, waiting in their pillboxes and prepared defences. Private Arthur Joel was there. As if by pre-arranged signal, enemy machine guns, automatics and snipers located in trees, gullies and bushes ahead and on the flanks opened with a hot fusillade which filled the air with snaps, cracks and whines of flying lead. For hours, German snipers, machine gunners and automatic riflemen, organised strongly in depth and well concealed, swept the area with a steady sheet of fire. Unable to move forward or back and stuck in the open, the leading infantry of the 79th took horrific casualties throughout the rest of the afternoon, desperately hoping that something could be done to relieve the pressure to their front. And there was an opportunity for exactly that. To the right of the 79th Division, the veteran 4th had made excellent progress and were already well ahead and facing little opposition. Had they that afternoon swung to their left around the back of Montfaucon, the defenders would have been cut off without supply or reinforcement, and the position would inevitably have fallen. In a controversial decision that is still debated, General Bullard did not authorise a move, and instead the 4th pushed straight ahead. The result was, tragically, more dead doughboys in the Meuse-Argonne. Further to the left, the attacks had also seen mixed results. In the Argonne, unsurprisingly, progress had been slow. Fog, confusion, difficult terrain, and the horror of discovering an unsuppressed enemy machine gun at less than 30 yards range made that advance a nightmare for the men of the 77th. But they did at least make some progress. To their right, in the more open Aire River Valley, there had been real progress. The attacking troops had captured the town of Varennes early on and pushed on through the rolling plains beside the forest. Here the Americans could play an ace, 2-man Renault light tanks which could cross the battlefield at relative speed. Leading them was a young colonel, George S. Patton. When approaching the village of Cheppy that morning, and frustrated at being held up, he got out and advanced on foot to scout ahead. He found himself in a very dangerous position, as he later recalled. I yelled, "Who comes with me?" A lot of doughboys yelled, but only 6 of us started. I hoped the rest would follow, but they would not. Soon there were only 3, but we could see the machine gun right ahead, so we yelled to keep up our courage and went on. Then the 3rd man went down, and I felt a blow in the leg. Hit in the groin by a machine gun bullet which exited via his buttock, reportedly leaving a teacup-sized exit wound, Patton's war, and very nearly his life, came to an end just here outside the village of Cheppy on that opening day. Despite the problems encountered, on balance, the first day of the battle was a considerable success. In some areas, troops advanced up to 6 miles and thousands of German prisoners had been taken. But one major problem surfaced: logistics. By the start of the second day, many American infantrymen were completely out of rations and water, and the enormous traffic jams in the rear meant there was very little chance of getting rations or even ammunition brought up. But the attack had to go on, and on the second day the entire focus lay here at Montfaucon. That morning the 79th attacked again, aiming for the old monastery at the top of the hill to their front, but after a bloody close-range fight were eventually forced back. It was only the intervention of the 37th Division attacking from the left who finally cracked the position. With tanks, artillery and determined assaults, they prized open the defence, and by the afternoon of the 27th the shattered church on the hill's crest had been taken. Finally, the advance could continue. Elsewhere, progress was good, with more troops advancing across open ground until hitting pockets of resistance which brought them to a halt. But the Americans were learning how to fight, and modern tactics were beginning to emerge as units fought far more integrated battles. Over the next few days, the pattern persisted. The German defence stiffened, with reinforcements constantly arriving, and the momentum began to slow. But it was in the Argonne where the real problems lay. Already in the first few days, Major Charles Whittlesey and his men had found themselves cut off when they'd advanced further than the units on their flanks, and then, on the 2nd of October, it happened again. This time, some 650 men from various units found a gap in the German line and passed through largely undetected, before digging in right here in the Charlevoix ravine. The problem was, nobody else did. When the following day the Germans resealed their line, the Lost Battalion, which wasn't a battalion and wasn't even lost, found themselves trapped. We've done a complete video on this subject right here on YouTube, so if you want to know more about that episode, be sure to check it out. Suffice to say that when on the 8th of October Whittlesey's men were finally relieved, less than 200 out of the 650 were able to walk out unaided. The reason they were was partly down to the actions of another famous soldier to emerge from the Meuse-Argonne, Alvin York. Born in rural Tennessee in 1887, York was quite unusual for a doughboy. A wild child in his youth, he'd had a religious conversion in 1915 and since then had become a convinced pacifist, even writing on his draft registration card that he did not want to fight. Nevertheless, by October 1918, he found himself fighting through the Aire River Valley next to the Argonne. York's division, the 82nd, were given the job of bypassing the German defences in the forest, swinging left into the Argonne to cut them off from the rear. That's exactly what was happening on the morning of the 7th of October when his unit approached the village of Château-Thierry. Moments later, the entire regiment were brought to a standstill when multiple machine guns opened up to their front. In an attempt to find a way through, a patrol of 19 men were sent around the flank of the German line. With them was Corporal Alvin York. Ambushed a short time later as they crossed the stream, the sergeant leading the patrol was wounded, leaving York in charge. According to the traditional story, though it's still hotly debated, he took up a position forward of his men and personally shot upwards of 20 Germans with his rifle. Minutes later, in a bid to get rid of the highly skilled marksmen on their flank, a charge was made at a lone York who reportedly single-handedly shot 4 men with his Colt 45 at just a few yards range. Accounts vary about what happened next, but several hours later, York and the remnants of his patrol emerged from the woods with a long line of prisoners in tow, having silenced the machine guns pinning down his comrades. Meeting his commanding general a short time later, the famous exchange took place. "Well, York, it seems you've captured the whole German army." "No, sir, I only got 132. York was eventually awarded the Medal of Honor and became a somewhat reluctant national celebrity. His actions, though, were truly important. With the Germans in the Argonne beaten and Whittlesey's men relieved, the fight on the left could finally begin to move, but not quickly. Before we continue, I want to pause for a moment. One of the frustrations with YouTube is that there's always some constraint, usually runtime, available visuals, or simply the fact there are so many details you can fit into a single film. That's why over the last few months I've teamed up with 3 historians, Dr. Spencer Jones, Jesse Alexander and Professor Matthias Strone, to create a new book, Inferno. The idea behind it was simple. Out of the hundreds of battles fought across the 2 world wars, which truly shaped the 20th century? Undoubtedly, the Meuse-Argonne is one of them, but there are plenty more too. From Jutland and the Somme to Stalingrad, Okinawa and Berlin. We've selected 12 battles and explored them in the depth that only a book really allows. More detail, more first-hand accounts, more analysis, and more of the stories that often get left behind. We're incredibly proud of what we've produced and we'd love your support. If you'd like to learn more or pre-order a copy, you'll find the links in the description below. Now, let's get back to the battle. Behind the lines, the logistical snarl-ups continued and got so bad that even while the Argonne fighting continued, Pershing was forced to order an operational pause to try and solve the situation. During that time, unsurprisingly really, it was noticed by senior American commanders that increasing numbers of doughboys were being found back behind the lines with little or no reason to be there. The result was the excellently named Hobo Barrage, where thousands of men were employed rounding up stragglers and sending them back to their units, often at the point of the bayonet. When finally the attacks restarted on the 12th of October, the Americans were in better shape. Artillery, the real king of the battlefield, was used with increasing effectiveness to reduce strong points as fresh American divisions were brought in to pin the enemy in place whilst others outflanked them in a gradual and brutal advance. When, within a couple of days, the French 17th Corps, advancing on the right-hand side of the Meuse River, managed to clear the major gun batteries on the heights overlooking the American advance, the attack picked up speed. Prominent amongst those leading the way was Lieutenant Colonel William Wild Bill Donovan, the man who would go on to head the OSS in World War II and become known as the father of the CIA. Showed incredible personal bravery in the Meuse-Argonne, as the citation for his Medal of Honor recalls. Lieutenant Colonel Donovan personally led the assaulting wave in an attack upon a very strongly organised position, and when our troops were suffering heavy casualties, he encouraged all near him by his example, moving among his men in exposed positions, reorganising decimated platoons, and accompanying them forward in attacks. When he was wounded in the leg by machine gun bullets, he refused to be evacuated and continued with his unit until it withdrew to a less exposed position. Despite the continued success, logistical problems simply wouldn't go away, forcing Pershing, who by now had split his force into two separate armies, to order another pause between the 16th and the 31st of October to prepare for one final push towards the rail hub, Sedan. It came at 3:30 am on the 1st of November 1918 when a hurricane bombardment slammed into German positions on their last defensive bastion of the Barricourt Heights, and it was here, for the Americans, where everything came together. Now artillery, infantry, aircraft, tanks and logistics finally fell into place, working with admirable cohesion and coordination, and over the course of several days the Americans, who had learned so quickly how to fight on the Western Front, smashed through the German lines, sending them into a headlong retreat which would only end at 11 am on the 11th of November with the signing of the armistice. The Battle of the Meuse-Argonne was over. But it didn't come cheap. All told, some 26,000 American troops lost their lives and more than 100,000 were wounded in just 47 days of battle, making it, day for day, bloodier than the Normandy campaign of World War II. But perhaps the real significance of the Meuse-Argonne, and why it should be considered at least one of the greatest battles in American history, is what it showed. When the offensive began, much of the American army had never fought a major battle. 47 days later, it had helped break the German army and bring the First World War to an end. The cost had been enormous, but so too had the transformation. The Meuse-Argonne was not simply America's largest battle. It was the battle in which America learned to fight a modern war. Thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed this story and would like to explore the Meuse-Argonne and even other battles that shaped the 20th century in far greater depth, you can pre-order your copy of Inferno using the links below. Available in hardback, ebook and audiobook. That's all for this time. We'll see you again soon.